Alexander, I see you're attempting to utilize the community emergency access point. The voice, sharp and laced with the unmistakable tang of self-importance, sliced through the crisp morning air. I froze, halfway through instructing Sal's burly foreman on where to position the ground protection mats. Brenda. Of course it was Brenda, clad in blindingly white sneakers that somehow remained pristine despite the dusty terrain, and sporting a visor that screamed authority figure on vacation. She clutched her eternal companion, a thick, laminated binder that I was convinced contained the sacred texts of suburban tyranny, the HOA bylaws. "Brenda," I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "It's Alex. And yes, Sal needs to get his geotechnical engineer down there to survey the footings. We went over this at the last HOA meeting. Remember, the one where you argued for 20 minutes about the thread count of the new pool towels? Sal, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 1,000 construction sites, just sighed and leaned on his shovel, his expression a masterclass in seeing it all, still unimpressed. His two crew members exchanged weary glances. They knew the drill. Any interaction with Brenda added at least an hour to the workday, usually filled with more head-scratching than actual construction. Brenda tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "The motion was to review your permits, Alexander, not to approve unsupervised access to a potential geological hazard. This gate," she gestured dramatically to the rusty chain link, "is for emergencies only. Is your deck on fire, Alex?" She said the word deck, with the same disdain one might reserve for a particularly virulent strain of mold. Before I could launch into a detailed explanation of structural engineering requirements and the necessity of proper soil analysis, a conversation I knew would be about as productive as explaining quantum physics to a goldfish, Brenda reached into an oversized canvas tote bag. My stomach sank. That bag was usually reserved for neighborhood watch paraphernalia and her aggressively organic snacks. But today, it yielded something far more sinister: an enormous industrial-grade padlock and a length of thick, hardened steel chain that looked like it belonged on a pirate ship. With a theatrical flourish that would have been comical if it wasn't actively sabotaging my entire project, she wrapped the chain around the gateposts, the metal groaning in protest. The padlock clicked shut with a resounding finality that echoed the death knell of my meticulously planned schedule. She gave the chain a sharp, almost possessive tug. "For the safety of the community," she announced, a smug little smile playing on her lips. It was the smile of a villain who genuinely believed she was the hero. She turned on her pristine white heels and began to march back towards her fortress of beige stucco, her visor casting a shadow over her self-satisfied face. Sal straightened up, pushing his helmet back on his head. He looked from the newly secured gate to me, then back to the gate again. "So, that's a no on the survey today?" I just stood there, staring at the gleaming new lock against the weathered metal of the gate. A slow, almost involuntary grin began to spread across my face. She had brought her own chain. You had to respect the level of commitment to petty obstruction. She genuinely thought she had won, thought this was checkmate in the ongoing saga of Alex versus the HOA. What Brenda didn't know, as she sashayed back to her meticulously manicured lawn, was that precisely 2 minutes ago, as I was confirming Sal's arrival time, my phone had buzzed with a text message. A message that read, "On our way. Hope you like heights." The saga of the deck, the dream that had morphed into a low-grade suburban war, had begun innocently enough a few months prior. Sarah and I had finally found it, the perfect house. Nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city, it boasted an open floor plan, great natural light, and most importantly, a breathtaking view. The backyard sloped down to a dramatic, albeit manageable, cliff face, offering panoramic vistas of the valley below. It was the kind of view that made you want to sip your morning coffee and contemplate the meaning of life, or at least which brand of organic yogurt to buy. The only catch, the tiny asterisk next to our dream home, was the Hawthorne Oaks Homeowners Association. And at the helm of this well-meaning but occasionally tyrannical organization was Brenda. Initially, our interactions were quirky, endearing, almost. The first week after we moved in, we received a polite, typed note informing us that our welcome mat, while aesthetically pleasing, technically extended 3 inches beyond the designated stoop perimeter as outlined in Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 12 of the HOA handbook. Brenda had even included a meticulously measured diagram. We chuckled, trimmed the mat, and chalked it up to the charming eccentricities of suburban life. Then came the incident of the rogue dandelion. I'd spotted a single, defiant yellow bloom in our front lawn and, in my blissful ignorance, had decided to deal with it later. Later, as it turned out, was apparently too late. A brightly colored sticker, reminiscent of a parking violation, adorned our front door, citing us for failure to maintain acceptable botanical uniformity as per Resolution 4.7b. The fine? $25. We paid it, slightly less amused. The true nature of Brenda's reign, however, began to reveal itself when I started planning the deck. The cliffside view was begging for an outdoor space, a multi-level masterpiece of redwood and steel cascading down the slope. A place for morning coffee with Sarah, evening barbecues with friends, and maybe even a hot tub someday, strategically positioned for maximum stargazing potential. I was determined to avoid any HOA drama. I hired a reputable architect, commissioned detailed structural plans, and even got a preliminary geological survey done, just to be thorough. Then came the arduous process of navigating the city's permit office, a bureaucratic labyrinth that made Dante's Inferno look like a relaxing spa day. Finally, armed with a thick stack of approved documents, I approached the Hawthorne Oaks Architectural Review Committee. The committee, as I soon discovered, consisted solely of Brenda and 2 elderly retirees, Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Abernathy, who looked perpetually terrified and nodded in agreement with everything Brenda said. The meeting took place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit community clubhouse, the air thick with the unspoken tension of impending bylaw violations. I presented my plans with the enthusiasm of a tech startup founder pitching a revolutionary new app. I had 3D renderings, material samples, and even a PowerPoint presentation titled Enhancing Community Value Through Thoughtful Outdoor Design. Brenda listened with a tight-lipped expression, her fingers drumming a silent rhythm on her laminated binder. Then came the objections, a barrage of nitpicking that would have made a Talmudic scholar blush. The proposed wood stain, cedar sunset, is not in harmony with the natural ochre of the indigenous rock formations, Brenda declared, as if the fate of the entire ecosystem hinged on my choice of sealant. And what measures will be taken to mitigate the potential noise pollution from your festivities, she continued, her voice dripping with suspicion. Will the sound of your inevitable revelry disturb the delicate nesting patterns of the western scrub jay, a protected species we are proud to host within our community? I had anticipated some pushback, but this was bordering on the surreal. I calmly refuted each point, armed with environmental impact reports I'd reluctantly commissioned, sound-dampening projections from my architect, and a veritable rainbow of wood stain samples. I even had a laminated chart detailing the nesting habits of the western scrub jay, demonstrating that their breeding season concluded well before my projected first barbecue. After what felt like an eternity of bureaucratic wrangling, punctuated by Mrs. Henderson's nervous coughs and Mr. Abernathy's occasional, barely audible, "I agree, Brenda," I finally secured the committee's approval. Brenda's smile, as she signed the approval form, didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who had lost a battle, but was already plotting the next skirmish. I naively believed the war was over. I had the permits. I had the HOA's blessing, however grudging. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, of course, was the Community Emergency Access Point Gate. It was a simple chain-link gate located at the far end of my property line, leading to a steep, but not insurmountable cliff that descended to the lower portion of my land. It was designated for emergency services, should they ever need to access the lower part of the property. However, it was also the only practical way to get heavy equipment and personnel to the lower construction site. The alternative was a 3-mile drive to the public park on the other side of the ravine, and then a precarious, mile-long hike through overgrown terrain, carrying tools and materials. My property line technically extended to include the gate and the small strip of land leading to it. I had confirmed this with my lawyer when we bought the house, specifically anticipating potential access issues. The gate, while technically on HOA-managed land, provided the sole reasonable ingress and egress to a significant portion of my property. My lawyer had assured me that preventing access for legitimate construction purposes would be legally problematic for the HOA. This made Brenda's subsequent actions not just petty, but, in my informed opinion, bordering on legally actionable. But dealing with lawyers took time and money, resources I'd rather invest in. You know, building my dream deck. "Nice plans. This is a big job," Sal had said, squinting at the blueprints spread across my kitchen island. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of past construction projects and long hours in the sun. "We'll need to get the geotech down there. First thing to check those footings. We'll just use that service gate around the back." I cleared my throat. "About that, we have a neighborhood watch captain who thinks she's guarding Fort Knox." Sal raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A what now?" I proceeded to recount my previous interactions with Brenda, the saga of the welcome mat and the dandelion, culminating in the ominous pronouncements at the Architectural Review Committee meeting. Sal listened with a growing look of incredulity. "So, this lady's gonna give us trouble with a locked gate?" he asked, his voice flat. "That's the working theory," I replied with a sigh. "She seems to think my deck constitutes some sort of existential threat to the HOA. True to my prediction, the first time Sal's crew showed up, ready to begin the initial site work, they found the gate securely locked with a flimsy master lock. I called Brenda, hoping a calm, rational conversation might resolve the issue. "Brenda, it's Alex. Sal's team is here, but the emergency access gate is locked. Could you possibly—" "Alexander," she interrupted, her voice tight with suspicion. "I saw those men lurking around the property. Unfamiliar vehicles. I have informed the neighborhood watch. This is precisely the kind of activity the emergency access point is designed to prevent. Unauthorized individuals potentially casing the neighborhood under the guise of deck construction." "Brenda, they have permits. I sent you a copy." "They're my contractors," I protested, my voice rising slightly. "Permits can be forged, Alexander, and frankly, I find it highly suspicious that you require such extensive access to this precipitous area. What are you really planning down there?" The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, culminating in Brenda hanging up on me with a curt, "I have reported suspicious activity to the authorities." Sure enough, an hour later, a black and white patrol car pulled up to the curb. Officers Miller and Davis emerged, looking as thrilled as teenagers being asked to clean their rooms. Officer Davis, young and by the book, approached Sal's crew, who were now sitting on the tailgate of their truck, looking thoroughly unimpressed. Officer Miller, older and with a permanent air of world weariness, ambled over to me. "HOA dispute?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "You have no idea," I muttered. I calmly explained the situation, presented my city permits, the property survey clearly showing the gate's location relative to my property line, and the precious HOA approval letter. Officer Davis, after examining the documents with diligent scrutiny, seemed satisfied. Officer Miller, meanwhile, had a brief but illuminating conversation with Brenda, who had emerged from her house, clipboard in hand, ready to present her case. I could hear snippets of her impassioned defense of the spirit of the bylaw and the potential endangerment to the community. He eventually returned, shaking his head slightly. Alex, it seems you have the necessary paperwork. Your property line does indeed extend to that area. However," he sighed, "as for forcing Miss Henderson—" "It's Brenda," I corrected automatically. "Right. Miss Brenda to unlock the gate. That's a civil matter. We can't really get involved without a court order." He gave me a sympathetic look. "Sometimes neighbors they disagree." They left, Brenda watching from her porch with a triumphant smirk that could curdle milk. Sal just shook his head. "So, what now, boss? We gonna call a lawyer?" I stood on my patio, staring at the locked gate, then down at the steep slope leading to the lower half of my yard. Frustration gnawed at me. A lawyer would take weeks, cost a fortune, and delay the project indefinitely. I was about to resign myself to a lengthy legal battle when Sarah joined me, a glass of iced tea in her hand. "So," she said, arching an eyebrow, "what's the plan? Are you going to sue the Wicked Witch of the West?" I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, my gaze fixed on the cliff face. I could work smarter, not harder. She locked the gate to the ground. She didn't lock the air above the ground. Sarah gave me a look that perfectly blended amusement and concern. "What are you plotting, you absolute menace?" My brain, a relic of my years in the tech industry, was already whirring. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Cliffside construction access, alternative access solutions, rope access for difficult terrain. Within minutes, I'd stumbled upon a website for a company specializing in rope access solutions. Their tagline, "When gravity is the only way down." It felt serendipitous. I picked up the phone and dialed. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and slightly amused. "Rope Access Solutions, Spike speaking." "Hi, Spike," I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. "I have a somewhat unusual request. I need to get a few people and some light equipment down a 60-foot cliff face in a residential neighborhood." There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a dry chuckle. "Is there an angry HOA president involved?" I blinked. How did you know?" "Son," Spike said, his voice now infused with a world-weary knowingness. "You're our third call this month with that exact scenario. We have a package for that." A few days later, Spike and his partner, Gear, arrived at my house for a site survey. They were the epitome of cool competence. Dressed in practical, slightly weathered work clothes, they moved with a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. They assessed the sturdy oak trees on my property that could serve as anchor points, surveyed the drop zone below, and meticulously calculated the rope lengths and equipment needed. They were utterly unfazed by the suburban absurdity of the situation, treating it with the same professional detachment they likely applied to inspecting skyscrapers or wind turbines. Sal, who had been understandably skeptical when I first mentioned my unconventional access plan, met Spike and Gear with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. But as he watched them expertly rig a practice line and explain their safety protocols, a slow grin spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, shaking his head in impressed disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day we were rappelling onto a construction site." The plan was set. Spike and Gear would arrive early the next morning, equipped to rappel themselves and the geotechnical engineer down to the lower level. Brenda's locked gate, her symbol of bureaucratic power, would be rendered utterly irrelevant. And that brings us back to the present. Brenda, having secured her little victory with the heavy-duty chain and padlock, was halfway back to her house when Spike's discreet gray van pulled up the street. Two figures emerged, carrying heavy-duty backpacks and coiled ropes that looked like they could moor a small yacht. They moved with a quiet, purposeful efficiency that contrasted sharply with the simmering suburban drama unfolding around them. Brenda, who had clearly been watching from her window, did a double take that would have been comical if I wasn't still slightly fuming about the locked gate. Her pristine white sneakers squeaked on the asphalt as she marched back towards us, her face a mask of indignant outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Who are you? You are trespassing! I am calling the police!" She brandished her phone like a weapon. Spike, without even glancing at her, continued to methodically unpack his gear, checking the knots on a thick climbing rope with practiced hands. "Ma'am," he said calmly, his voice level, "we are on private property at the invitation of the owner. Please stand back 5 yards. This is a safety line." The geotechnical engineer, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Henderson, no relation to the terrified Mrs. Henderson of the HOA committee, thankfully, looked slightly bewildered but stood patiently by, clutching his soil testing equipment. The moment came. Spike secured my harness, a complicated web of straps and buckles that made me feel like an astronaut preparing for a spacewalk. "Lean back," he instructed, his voice matter-of-fact. "Trust the rope. Don't look down. Actually, you'll have to look down. Just don't freak out." Taking a deep breath, I edged towards the cliff. There was a brief, terrifying lurch in my stomach as I went over the edge, the ground suddenly falling away beneath my feet. But then the rope tightened, and I was descending smoothly, the world tilting around me. Below I could see Brenda, her face a study in apoplectic fury, her phone held aloft, presumably documenting my illegal descent. Her shrieks, though muffled by the distance, carried a distinct note of outrage. I landed gently on the lower level, a slight adrenaline rush coursing through me. It felt ridiculously triumphant. Mr. Henderson followed, his descent a little less graceful but equally effective. Finally, Spike rappelled down, landing beside us with a soft thud. Gear remained at the top, managing the anchor lines. They were professional, focused, and completely unfazed by the furious woman gesticulating wildly at the top of the cliff. Just as Mr. Henderson was setting up his soil testing equipment, I heard the familiar wail of police sirens approaching. Of course, Brenda's ultimate weapon. Officer Miller and Officer Davis arrived, lights flashing, pulling up beside Sal's truck. Brenda practically sprinted to their car, pointing down the cliff with dramatic accusations. "They're staging some kind of paramilitary invasion on my street!" Officer Miller, with the weary sigh of a man who had spent his entire career mediating neighborhood disputes, and Officer Davis, looking slightly more concerned, walked over to the edge of the cliff. Miller peered down, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he yelled down, his voice echoing across the small ravine. "Can you explain what's going on here?" I straightened up, feeling a surge of something akin to glee. "Just accessing the lower half of my yard, officer," I yelled back up. "The gate was stuck." Spike, ever the professional, approached the officers at the top, presenting their company's insurance documentation, safety certifications, and a signed work order from yours truly. Sal, leaning over the edge, held up the stack of city permits and my property survey for the officers to inspect again, The whole exchange was a bizarre, almost comical ballet of suburban absurdity and legitimate logistical problem-solving. Officer Davis, looking increasingly bewildered, flipped through his codebook as if searching for a bylaw against rappelling onto your own property. Officer Miller, however, seemed to have reached his Brenda-related limit. Officer Davis continued to leaf through his rulebook, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if the Hawthorne Oaks Municipal Code might contain a specific clause prohibiting rope-assisted property access in the context of a locked emergency gate. Officer Miller, however, simply closed the younger officer's manual with a decisive thwack. "Officer Davis," Miller said, his voice laced with a patient weariness that suggested this was not his first rodeo with Brenda's interpretation of community regulations. "I think we've established that Mr. Henderson—" "It's Alex," I called up again, just to be helpful. "Mr. Alex is on his own property. He has hired a licensed and insured company to facilitate access to said property. They haven't set foot on any HOA common ground other than the immediate vicinity of a gate that, frankly, seems to be causing more problems than it's solving. As far as I can see," Miller concluded, his gaze turning towards Brenda, who was still sputtering indignantly, "there is no crime being committed here." "But the gate!" Brenda shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass. "The bylaws clearly state that the emergency access point is for—" "Emergencies, ma'am," Miller finished for her, his tone flat. "And, as I pointed out earlier, Mr. Alex has provided documentation indicating his legitimate need to access his property for permitted construction. Locking that gate, in this context, seems less like preventing an emergency and more like creating one." He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing, his voice taking on a distinctly less patient edge. "This is the third time we've been called to this residence for a non-criminal HOA-related dispute this month, Miss Henderson." "It's Brenda," she insisted, her face reddening. "Right, Miss Brenda. If we are called again for a similar matter, we may have to consider citing you for misuse of emergency services. Have a nice day." With that, Officer Miller turned and began walking back to the patrol car, leaving a stunned and speechless Brenda standing on the edge of the cliff, her phone still clutched in her hand. Officer Davis, after a moment of hesitation, followed his partner, giving me a brief, almost apologetic shrug as he went. It was a beautiful sight. Brenda, the self-proclaimed guardian of Hawthorne Oaks, utterly defeated by logic, paperwork, and a healthy dose of rope technology. She stood there for a long moment, staring down at us with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred before finally turning and stomping back towards her house, her pristine white sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust in her wake. It was the walk of shame, suburban edition. Down below, Mr. Henderson, unfazed by the preceding drama, had already begun taking soil samples. Spike and Gear started efficiently coiling their ropes and packing up their gear, their movements a testament to their experience and professionalism. As Spike secured the last coil, he gave me a respectful nod and a slight grin. "Call us when you need to get the hot tub down here," he said with a wink, before heading back up the rope. As nimble as a mountain goat. Sal, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from the top of the cliff, his arms crossed and a wide grin plastered across his face, finally let out a hearty laugh. "Kid," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as I rejoined him, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen guys get into fistfights with building inspectors. I've seen lawsuits over a misplaced shrub. I have never, ever seen somebody rappel to get a soil sample. You're a legend." The geotechnical survey went off without a hitch. Over the next few weeks, the construction of the deck began in earnest. Materials were carefully maneuvered down the slope, using a small, temporary crane that we positioned entirely within my property lines, much to Brenda's visible consternation. Every day, I would catch glimpses of her peering through her blinds, a silent, fuming observer of the progress she had so vehemently tried to prevent. The rhythmic hammering and sawing became the soundtrack of my sweet, sweet victory. Finally, after weeks of planning, permitting, and precarious construction, the deck was finished. It was everything Sarah and I had dreamed of and more. A sprawling, multi-level structure of warm redwood, seamlessly integrated with the natural slope of the cliff. It boasted comfortable seating areas, ambient lighting, and even the pre-wired connections for that future hot tub. The view, now framed by the beautiful craftsmanship, was even more spectacular. To celebrate, we decided to throw a small, informal barbecue. The guest list included Sarah, of course, Sal and his hard-working crew, and our honored guests, Spike and Gear, the unsung heroes of Operation Cliffhanger. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, we all gathered on the newly completed deck, beers in hand, the aroma of grilling burgers filling the air. I raised my can in a toast. "To creative problem-solving," I said, a grin spreading across my face, "and to neighbors who inspire us to think outside the box, or, in this case, outside the gate." Everyone laughed, the sound echoing across the peaceful evening. Spike and Gear recounted tales of other unusual access challenges they'd faced, their stories ranging from rescuing cats from precarious ledges to inspecting the undercarriage of bridges. Sal regaled us with his own anecdotes of bureaucratic battles and eccentric clients. As the laughter subsided, we noticed Brenda in her yard, ostentatiously watering her meticulously manicured petunias. She pointedly avoided looking in our direction, her posture radiating disapproval. Just as a comfortable silence settled over our group, a sudden, high-pitched whirring sound broke the tranquility. Brenda's automatic sprinkler system, with a mind of its own, suddenly malfunctioned, the sprayers turning erratically. One rogue jet of water swung around with surprising force, drenching Brenda from head to toe. For a moment there was stunned silence on the deck. Then, as the absurdity of the scene registered, we all erupted in uncontrollable laughter. Brenda stood there, dripping and aghast, a picture of utter defeat. It was the perfect karmic cherry on top of our hard-won victory. Later that evening, as the last of our guests departed, Sarah and I sat on the deck, the soft glow of the outdoor lights illuminating the redwood. I took a sip of my beer, my arm around Sarah, the breathtaking view stretching out before us. I reflected on the ridiculousness of the whole ordeal, the petty tyranny of Brenda, the unexpected ingenuity of rope access, and the sheer satisfaction of overcoming an absurd obstacle. The fight hadn't just been about a deck. It was about not letting a small-minded bully with a laminated rule book dictate my life. And as I looked out at my magnificent, hard-won view, I couldn't help but smile. It was worth every single ridiculous second. Best view in the neighborhood, and the best story to go with it.